Hello. We're live. I don't know who I'm saying we to. I guess potentially people here who are viewing this. Welcome. Welcome to the This Is Not Therapy Hour. I'm Brandon Tessers. I'm a licensed therapist, but this is not therapy for many reasons. This is just a weekly hour that I stream, usually with somebody, but today solo, to talk to you guys, uh, whoever's here in chat. If you're watching and not in chat, then I'm still talking to you, but I can't respond to you because I don't know anything about you. So I'm just going to be talking about some stuff. We did one of these a couple weeks back, and we'll probably pick up at that same place. Hello in the chat there. But as always, those of you who are in chat, questions, comments, anything you do is a conversation. Anything you do impacts me and what I'm thinking and what I do next. So I would encourage anybody here to be in the chat and put out there whatever it is that you want to put out there. Questions, things you want to talk about, really anything. And I've been saying this some lately, that if you're on Twitch, it'll be under your Twitch name. And I, as you just saw, I don't call out names from the chat usually. Sometimes I do, but I try not to, just in case people don't want their name said on the stream. But if you're on Twitch, it'll be your Twitch handle. If you're on YouTube, it'll be your Gmail account. And if you're on Facebook, it'll be your Facebook account. And for those last two, you can always, make up something new with a fake name or whatever to contribute if you want to do it that way. But yeah, here we are. It's just me, Brandon. And I am being driven a little bit to distraction by the fact that I love my office. I'm so excited that this is the office that I have. I was so excited when we saw it, and we saw it back in spring, and we moved in the summer. And the thing that I did not consider was about the fact that the angle of the sun changes in the winter and with the time change. And so now the sun is like blasting in different windows at different times of day. So I keep getting distracted by like little glare things here and there. Not super relevant, although I don't know if it's worth going down that path, but we make assumptions. The brain has to make assumptions. Of course, if I had thought about, oh, wait, the angle of the sun changes in the winter. I mean, I probably still would have gotten this office anyway. I love this office. But let's talk a little bit about heuristics, I guess. Why not? It's just me here. Until and unless somebody puts something else out there. With a stream on Thursdays. Oh, that's a good question. So last Thursday, we did a stream from 10:30 to noon, and that was a specific specialized stream, and it won't be repeating. So what that was, for anybody who's curious, another therapist and I, a woman by the name of Emily Kircher Morris, who's a friend of mine, who is also very focused on neurodiversity, is neurodivergent herself. The two of us are putting together what's called a peer consultation group. In therapy, it's an ethical kind of requirement that you get supervision as a therapist. Therapists need to be able to rely on their supervisors. You have to have a place to go and take things. But for those of us who are in private practice and who run private practices and are supervisors and don't have supervisors ourselves, instead of supervision, we do peer consultation groups where we get together with other people like us and we use that group as kind of our version of supervision. So we're putting together one for people who are focused on neurodiversity and who, we're neurodiversity affirming therapists. And it's the first Thursday of every month. And last Thursday was the first Thursday of this month. So at that time, that 10:30 to noon time when it will be, we did a stream as a town hall kind of Q&A for people who were interested in the group. And I should say too, that one of the things that we talked about in that stream is that it is not a requirement that somebody be a licensed therapist to be a part of it. Not we are intending, the intention was to start one group with the two of us and about 5 or 6 other people, because you can't make them too big before they kind of lose their effectiveness. But depending on the interest that we get, we might do it in different ways. We might start multiple groups or, structure it differently. And so that's what it was, that we were talking about that. And if anybody is interested in being part of a group where practitioners or, people who care about neurodiversity and how to work with people who are neurodivergent or just the concept in general, where we can kind of get together and support each other in that. So that's what that was. And then also, if anybody's ever noticed, we are occasionally doing some body doubling streaming as well. Particularly so far just with Amelia, who's one of our coaches and joined us on this stream a few weeks back, who is an artist, a visual artist. We're all artists in one way or another. And she's just occasionally hopping on to do body doubling. For anybody who doesn't know that phrase, the idea of body doubling is that it is easier to engage on a task when in the presence of other people engaging with tasks in a similar way. I think we talked about that when Amelia was on. But if anybody's seeing things go live there, that's the idea there, is that you can go watch Amelia, and though it's theoretically not as impactful as being in the same room with somebody to do body doubling, it's better than not being with anybody at all. And she's doing visual art. So if you're doing a similar kind of thing, theoretically, again, it's more impactful. And the larger the gap between what she's doing and what you're doing, theoretically, the less impactful it gets. And as for now, that's all that I think that's all that we've done on these channels, although there's going to be a lot more happening. But of course, I get out over my skis a lot, get ahead of myself a lot. So there's lots of things in the works, but I don't know exactly when, and I don't want to make promises to people that we don't keep. But there should theoretically be a lot more content coming out, both in terms of stream and just on the YouTube channels. And we've recently started posting things on social media, which is like a particular weak point of mine. But we're doing more there, and it's exciting. It's fun times. There's lots of stuff happening. So thank you for the question, and keep them coming, anybody. But for now, back to heuristics. I'm honestly not sure if I've discussed this on the stream before, and I know I repeat myself. So, anybody in chat, feel free to tell me. But I also do it because there are new people, and I don't know who knows what is just about what's on my mind and seems helpful and relevant at the moment. Heuristic, it's a word I love. And as with many words that I use, I have my own specific way of defining it because that's just how I work. But what heuristics means, generally speaking, literally it's time-saving device, right? Like etymologically, the root words and whatever. But what heuristic means is typically the word is used in reference to satisfactory ways of getting to a thing that are not optimal. I'm already doing a terrible definition. If you look it up, the definition you'll find is it's a way of going about doing or learning something that involves the experience of doing or learning something, as opposed to like the theory of doing or learning something. And you can see there's a reason that it's not a word that people throw around a lot. It's kind of specific and niche and vague. Here's how I use it. It is the same concept. I just apply it a little differently. The idea being, as it came up just a minute ago, that the vast, vast, vast majority of what we do, we have no conscious observation of or thought for or intent. We just do in response to things. And, the typical examples there are breathing and blinking and heart beating and stuff, right? That our body does all kinds of stuff. But even when something is intentional, even when I have an intentional, I'm going to take a sip of my coffee and intentionally reach out and grab it, the amount of data that my body has to pay attention to, detect, in order to determine how heavy is this and where's the balance and will it spill and how hard should I hold it that's not too hard that I'm hurting myself, or potentially drop it but not too loose, and etc., is just not something that we're literally capable of consciously doing. So even the things we do intentionally, the vast majority of the stuff that is happening there is being done without any intentional input, any conscious input. So heuristics are rules, basically assumptions that we make, that the brain makes, not consciously, pre-consciously. In other words, we talk a lot about attentional processes that dictate what things you pay attention to and what things you don't, and you can't totally control it, and etc. Heuristics is kind of the flip side of looking at that. We're not consciously making an assumption that I don't need to pay attention to the angle of the sun and how it will change in the winter. I just am not paying attention to it because my pre-conscious processes are deeming that that's not worth thinking about. Perhaps because I'm not aware that it's a thing at all, perhaps because I'm aware that it's a thing, but it doesn't seem relevant or necessary, or just blah, blah, blah. So heuristics in that sense, they're not a thing we actively do. They're a way of describing what we think must have been true for our brain. What our brain must have been assuming is that that was not important, not that it's an active process. Long story short, they're rules. They're rules that are useful, they are convenient, and they are limited. They're ways of approaching things, and we use them for everything all the time. They can be as granular and specific and tiny and detailed as, like, when I see something that has this shape to it and that shit, and behaves in this way, that is my dog, right? Like, that's a heuristic. A perceptual set is a type of heuristic. And they can be much bigger and broader and more general too, of like, hard work equals success, like things like that, right? Just assumptions that we're making. And we never like disprove heuristics, we just modify and clarify them, right? If I have a heuristic if I have a rule, my brain has a rule that says, I'm trying to think of one that's real and I'm struggling, so I'm just going to use an example that's made up of, if my brain has a heuristic of, oh, dogs are safe and cute and nice and cuddly and I should pet them. Well, then I'm going to do that until I do it and it doesn't work. I go and pet a dog and it snaps at me, at which point I refine the heuristic, theoretically, if I learn from that experience. And how I refine it changes. It might be, well, dogs are cute and cuddly and I should pet them, except for that specific dog. Or it might be, dogs are cute and cuddly and I should pet them unless they are a dog I don't know, or unless they are growling, or it could, the whole thing could be, dogs are cute and cuddly and I should pet them unless I don't want to get bitten. And it just applies to all dogs, right? Trauma, in a sense, is like modifying heuristics or creating even potentially new ones. I don't even remember why I started talking about heuristics, but that's just the way that it's a conceptual framework of looking at how we navigate things. Anything we don't pay attention to, we just can say, oh, our brain assumed that was not worth paying attention to. Oh, because of the angle of the sun. That's why I was talking about it. My brain assumed that was not worth considering. And, honestly, a lot of things could change that. It could have been, maybe if I was more of a gardener, and I don't even know if this is true, because anybody who pays attention to the plants in the background, I don't do well with them. But maybe if I did and I knew a lot more about that, I might have considered, well, oh, this window is south facing and that window is west facing, and that means this and this and that, right? Some people will walk into a room and evaluate it that way. I don't. There are other things that I'll walk into a room and pay attention to and evaluate because my heuristics are different than other people's, and they won't pay attention to it. I mean, that's that's pretty much what we're doing here. Is I just point things out that I'm paying attention to, not as though I know it better or more thoroughly, but just things that I notice. And all I'm saying is, hey, have you noticed this too? If not, now your brain has incentive to start to pay attention to it. And maybe it's helpful and maybe it's not. And if you have already noticed it, well, it still might modify it in terms of how I phrase it or put it out there, that like, oh, I did notice it, but I didn't connect it to that thing or whatever. I'm getting pretty philosophical. And you know what, honestly, I would like to do today is try to be very practical, which is going to be an extra challenge with no other person here with me to ask practical and specific questions or help me to refocus and remember when I'm getting too philosophical or conceptual. Is it because of how your brain works? Ooh, that's a good question. And the answer is yes. And yes, and it's not a causal relationship, meaning that everything any of us do is our brain's way of navigating the context that we find ourselves in. And context includes the, environment to the extent that we detect it, sense it, notice it, right? But it also includes other things, heuristics, that if I, for example, here's a pretty common one that a lot of times people will play like a flinching game with their friends when they're younger. Maybe this is, I'm guessing this is more common with boys than with girls, but I don't know if that's the case, where people will jump out and scare you, or, act like, do a quick jerk, and the body reacts by flinching. And you can train yourself not to do that by changing the context, because what's happening is your brain is looking at, oh, it looks like I might be about to get hit, or it looks like something might be attacking me, so I need to prepare for that, react as though that's the case. Well, the exact same thing can continue to happen, the exact same stimuli, but because we're coming into it with new heuristics, the context is different. And I'm saying, no, be prepared. As I go around this corner, my friend might jump out at me. And if so, don't flinch. And then we don't. So yes, the answer is yes, is because of how my brain works. The part that's the problem there is that we don't know why our brains work the way that they work. And we know pieces of it. Again, all of this is like constructs and things. A lot of it we're making guesses at, but guesses that hold up and allow us to do useful things and things like that. This is all right. We'll talk a little bit about epigenetics. I honestly don't even know if this is a practical thing or not. It seems practical to me. There's a concept, epigenetics, a word, epigenetics, which basically means how our genetics are impacted by the environment that we're exposed to over the course of our lives. That whatever your genes are, your genetic code, let's say, for example, that as a lot of research has shown, that there's a correlation between certain genetic expressions and alcoholism. Well, that does not mean that you're predestined to be alcoholic. You'd still have to be exposed to alcohol, for one. If you've never seen alcohol, how could you be alcoholic? And that's a particularly egregious example, but it's true of all genetic things that we talk about. In other words, genes are not fate. It's not predestination. You can have the genetic code to grow to a certain height, for example, that your body would theoretically grow to whatever height. But then if you don't have the right nutrition at the right times in your life, or if you suffer a certain injury, then that changes. And in particular, this is getting out of my depth. I don't know the details on this stuff, but what little I know about this is very fascinating to me, that it changes our genetic code in turn, that it's not just how the genes express, but that our genes change. So there's been research done in things like that when a person experiences trauma, that can be encoded into their genes and therefore passed down through genetics. Of course, the problem with all this is it's correlation, not causation. We can just look at things that happen in tandem. We can't say X is because of Y. But let me address your question less literally and get at what I think you're more asking, which is, what is the way in which my brain works differently that results in me approaching things differently? If I'm not reading it accurately, please clarify and let me know. But our brains are shaped over the course of our lives. This is another part of why epigenetics is so important, that everything you do, everything you experience, there's a term, myelination. So for a quick way of saying it, the pithy way of saying it, sometimes therapists or, neuroscientists will say neurons that fire together wire together. So everything that your brain does involves electrical signals being passed down neural pathways from one neuron to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next. And every time that happens, in response, there's a biological process called myelination, which, without getting too technical, basically just means that the next time that neural pathway is activated, the electrical signal passes along that pathway more easily. So every time you do a particular thing, it becomes easier for you to do that thing in the future. And energy literally takes the path of least resistance. This is a lot of what people are talking about when we're talking about habits, is that we have ways of responding to the environment that are our default, habitual, whatever you want to call, are the way that we would respond if we didn't put effort into responding differently than that. In other words, to a person with a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. If I solve problems by punching them, then when a new problem comes up, I'm going to look for where I can punch it. If I solve problems by thinking through them, then when a new problem comes up, I'm going to try and think through it. And sometimes one way is better and sometimes another way. It depends on the context. But yeah, my brain works the way that it does. How much of it, is chicken and the egg in a sense. We can't say why exactly it got to be the way that it is, but we can say after enough time, like the things that we do the most are the things that we're going to continue to do the most, whatever that is. And again, we can break that down very specifically, or we can make it very big. We can say, I go to bed around 11 o'clock, right? Which is kind of a more broad thing. Or I could say, I go to bed when I'm tired, which is even more broad. Or I could say, yesterday I went to bed, blah, 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 under this context and that context, and therefore I went to bed at 12 instead of 11 like I normally do. All this is made up. Basically, I talk and I listen and I think a lot about how the brain works, how my brain works, how other people's brains work, why we do what we do, why I do what I do, why the things I struggle with, and so on. And the more I do that, the more my brain is predisposed to doing that again in response to something new. And then that makes it even more likely to do it again and again and again and again. The kinds of people who we end up, most likely are going to be here tend to be ones that think through things, try to think through things, try to use intellect as a way to navigate things, solve problems intellectually, cognitively. And some problems are very well suited to being solved in that way, and some not so much. I've referenced in the past that intelligence, maybe this is a good day for ranting about intelligence because this is part of the answer to your question. The general concept we have of what intelligence is a terrible one. It's not. Everything serves a purpose, and it serves a purpose. It's just not what it doesn't serve the purpose that it seems like it should, that we all think that it does. Intelligence is not a personality trait. It's not a thing that follows a person context to context. If you attempt to define it, and go ahead, do it right now. Everybody who's watching this, define intelligence for yourself and write it down maybe, and then go ask somebody else to define it. And maybe some of the points will be similar or the same, but it's not going to be exactly. And that's true even for the people who research it, the people who study intelligence, the people who've made the tests that we use in order to measure intelligence. Nobody can agree on what it is, because like a lot of these things, it's a construct. It's not an entity that we can observe. We're observing things, and then we put together an idea of why what we're observing happens the way that it does and is predictable the way that it is. So people will sometimes try to say, oh, intelligence is kind of a general ability to distinguish what information is useful and what information isn't, and to bring that information in and incorporate it into the strategies that you're utilizing in your attempts to accomplish whatever it is you're trying to accomplish, so that you are more likely to accomplish it or accomplish it more easily, or things like that. But there's just nothing like that is independent of context, for the reasons we were talking about. Opportunity cost. Every moment I spend doing one thing is a moment I spend not doing all the other things I could have done. I can't be equally good at everything across the board. Nobody can. And we can't even really say, how would we measure if one person was generally, globally more successful than another person? How would we be able to look at that and isolate it from all external conditions and all external variables and say, no, this is because of something purely about how their brain works? Pretty much every study that's been done over the years about intelligence gets debunked eventually when somebody realizes, oh, hey, there's this other variable that we weren't paying attention to there. And I won't rant too much about the origins of this, because other people are better suited to it, know more about it than I do. But the, quick and easy way to say it is that it originates in eugenics, and people trying to come up with explanations for why some people succeed and some people don't, independent of the environment. Oh, you could succeed just as much as I succeed, except that I'm smart and you're not. even though we can't really define that. It's really a fascinating field. There's a book by Scott Barry Kaufman called Ungifted that's a good book on this subject. But the concept is popular because it serves a purpose. And I don't know, maybe we will get into all things if I'm just going to be talking here by myself today. But most relevant here is frequency and efficiency, not accuracy. Meaning, intelligence is a thing that all humans have, right? It's not that we lack it or, have it or don't. We all have it. If theoretically, or to whatever extent theoretically, it is something that varies in some way from person to person, then that would still be about frequency and efficiency. Meaning, intelligence is the ability to deal with thought, cognition, which is not the same thing as observing reality. It's a limited subset. Anything we are thinking, no matter how accurate, no matter how useful, is limited. Picture a memory, even a memory of what I just said 2 seconds ago. Think of that memory. And the memory you're thinking of, everything you're thinking of in that memory is accurate, most likely, but there's a lot that's missing. What exactly did my face look like in that moment when I said that thing? How exactly were you sitting, right? Like, there's data that's lost. So we compress that data so that we can think about it. And that's really useful because one thing that we can't observe but can think about is the future. So when we do break down intelligence into certain definable skills, a lot of it will be about pattern recognition and data extrapolation or interpolation, the ability to make accurate predictions. But making a prediction accurate requires that you have specific knowledge about the thing that you're making predictions about. I can make very good and accurate predictions, likely to be accurate predictions about people and what they're saying or what they're feeling or what they might do next. I don't have the same ability to make those predictions about the weather because I don't have the specific knowledge and information and experience about that. So, broadly speaking, I am more likely to try to think my way through a problem than to approach it in a different way. Think, talk, those two things are more or less the same. There's differences, but thinking and communicating, well, that's complicated too. Because you can do it in your own head without communicating with anybody else. But semiotics, signs and symbols matter here. I said I want to be practical. I'm getting real philosophical. I utilize my intelligence more frequently than other people might. And perhaps as a result of that, perhaps as a cause of that or whatever, but another thing that happens in tandem reliably and predictably across everybody is the more you do a thing, the faster you get at it. So in other words, I'm running scenarios of, here's the problem, here's a way of understanding it, because they're all limited. So I can tell a bunch of different stories about it, each of which, if I were to think that this is true, then I would do this thing. So let me imagine doing that thing, and then what I think would happen from there. I can run those fast. And sometimes that's great if I have experience and specific knowledge about what thing I'm trying to make predictions about, because I can, instead of having to do it and try it and do it and try it, I can just imagine this. No. That's the one that would work. It's also terrible when it's a thing that I don't have specific knowledge and information about, because what will happen is I am going to make inaccurate predictions. I'm still likely, unless something reminds me or interrupts my process, my default is still going to be to try and think my way through a problem, but I just don't know enough about the problem to do that very effectively. So I'm going to get stuck in my head thinking over and over. And the more we do that, this is inevitable. The more that any person, the more like kind of solution attempts or theoretical trials or scenarios that they run, over time, eventually they'll end up thinking about all the stuff that doesn't work. Because every time we think of a thing, oh, okay, that would be fine. So I can stop thinking about that potential. Oh, okay, that would be fine. Oh, well, that wouldn't be great. What would I do? Oh, I could do this and this, and then it would be fine. Oh, that would be terrible. What can I do? Oh, no, I don't know what I can do. And that's where we get stuck and we don't move on to the next one. So intelligent people cycle faster. They're more likely to get into things like that more quickly than other people. It is situationally advantageous and disadvantageous. So yeah, that's how my brain works. Is I try and tell stories in my head. I say, what if this were true? Let me pretend that this way of looking at it was the most useful way to look at it. If that were the case, what would I do? And of course, all of this for all of us is happening just in a moment to moment. But whatever you have most experience with, ask me about DMing Dungeons and Dragons, and I'll be able to tell you lots of stuff. I don't need to even ask you that many questions about what you're doing and what your problem is. I have a lot of experience with it, and I'm good with language and communication too, so I can find things there. But, if you ask me how to bake delicious cookies, I'm not going to be able to tell you much. Does that kind of answer your question? So, yes, it's about how the brain works, but how the brain works is impacted by what we do, and what we do is impacted by how the brain works. Yeah, accuracy in terms of predictions is really, you have to have the knowledge and information that you need in order to be able to arrive to be able to evaluate whether one of your guesses, your predictions about the future is likely to be accurate. How would you know that without context, previous experience, right? So I can make more attempts more quickly than somebody else might, but that doesn't mean that they'll be useful ones. There's a reason that we have stereotypes and anecdotal correlations between various types of neuroses and intelligent people, right? I think there's probably more. Well, there's definitely a lot more I could say about intelligence. For example, the term gifted in relation to the idea of intelligence as an inheritable trait was originally used in that context by a eugenicist in a eugenicist book. And eugenics, if you don't know, is the idea that we should stop some people from having children and make other people have children in order to improve the genes of the entire human species, which is obviously all kinds of problematic, but is logical if you accept that intelligence is globally beneficial, or any trait, any personal trait, but intelligence is one that we generally think of that way in our culture, that intelligence is always good. It's in all cases always better to be intelligent, more intelligent than less intelligent. And if you also assume that it is purely genetic, right, that it is hereditary for genetic reasons and not for other reasons, which is also a flawed concept. If you accept that both those things are true, it's pretty hard to come up with an argument against the monstrous eugenics idea that doesn't rely just on a notion that all people are valuable, which of course I agree with. But that's, that's the problem with accepting those ideas, that certain ways of being are globally beneficial, just in all cases, in all ways better than a potential alternative. This is why we don't use the deficit model. The idea that a certain way of being is a deficit means that the other way of being is always globally advantageous. And if that's true, especially in this vague concept of intelligence, which mostly, by the way, when people say smart, stupid, whatever, mostly all they really mean in common, like day-to-day speech, what we're saying is, I think they're good and I think they're bad. If I say that person is smart, I just mean I like them and I like what they're doing. And if I say I think they're dumb, it means I don't like them and I don't like what they're doing. Evolution works in that way, right? Well, that, again, is a little outside of my field, but yes and no. The thing about evolution is that it requires what's called selection pressure to do what we mostly think of it doing, meaning if a species evolves in a certain direction, it's not because of some like vague idea that way of being is better. It's because something happened in the environment that made it that only some could survive and some could not. And over time, the ones that survive tend to be in this kind of a way. So selection pressure means the environmental conditions which make it so that one thing is actually advantageous. Smart species survive. Well, so again, actually, that's a really good way of talking about what I just said, that we usually use smart to mean successful or good, and dumb to mean unsuccessful or bad. It's kind of a placeholder. You know, if we were to say smart species survive, the only way that that can be true is if we're defining smart as things that survive. So it's tautological, it's recursive, it just proves itself. Because if we're defining it in some kind of material way about how brains work or whatever, then no, there's no global thing we could say about how species utilize their brains that is generally, you know, more geared towards survival, right? Like the most common forms of life are single-celled organisms. How smart can they be, kind of thing. So yeah, you know, humans, evolution is just weird. It's not really something our brains are very well equipped to actually deal with. Kind of like when you get up to numbers like billions, where we understand it's a lot, but we don't really think of a billion as 1,000 millions. You know, it's hard for our brains to fully grasp the depth of that. Coincidence? Yeah. I mean, yes, coincidence literally meaning two things that occur together. So yeah, just not random, although in many cases unpredictable. You know, like evolution could have a predictable course, but only if we know enough about the environmental conditions and what changes will occur. If there's no selection pressure, if there's plenty of resources to go around and everybody's doing okay and whatever, then nothing spreads throughout a species because everybody just keeps passing on their own genes. In fact, diversity occurs more. And then once, you know, so in times where there's not, again, way out my field, so I'm probably, you know, really mangling this, but in times where there's less selection pressure, a species is going to have more diversity. Mutations are more likely to be passed on because without the selection pressure, something that mutates in a certain way is less likely to be killed by environmental conditions. So species gets more diverse, and then when the selection pressure occurs within that diversity, theoretically, something is more well suited to the new conditions, and that thing becomes more common, right? Like at some point, you know, a polar bear, whatever gave birth to a polar bear didn't have all white fur, kind of thing, right? And then it just, because mutation, as much as I love X-Men, it's just genetic variation, right? Like, oh man, I'm getting so philosophical here today. But this is really what the concept of neurodiversity is about. And I know we talked a lot about that last week, so we probably won't get into it as much today. But yeah, the idea is that more diversity within a group means that whatever problem arises, the group is better suited to deal with it because it has more varied experiences, traits, abilities to draw on. And of course, that comes along with the need to communicate and specialize and all that kind of stuff. It seems like it's just you and me here today, at least in the chat. So whatever you want to talk about, put it out there and we'll go in that direction. And I'm going to try and give myself until and unless you come up with, I have some of those phrases, right? Until and unless. Yeah, ask as many questions as you want. If other people are watching, and I have no way, I don't know, by the way, maybe somebody knows about this. I have no way of knowing how many people are watching. No idea. I know who's talking in the chat. Like I can see who's talked and who hasn't. But yeah, whatever other people are watching, they're not in the chat, at least right now. So ask as many questions as you want. Sometimes when I do consults with people, I'll tell them, like, show up to the stream and utilize it. You know, like if if therapy or coaching or whatever is not a good fit for you, this is a way. So if it's just one person here, then yeah, it's an hour for you to ask me whatever you want to ask and us to have a conversation. I still will talk as though there's more than one person here because I think there's probably more than one person watching, but only one person talking in chat today. Which, by the way, I think about all the time what things I might be able to do to make it easier for people to put things in chat, because I understand that there's a barrier to entry there. And if anybody ever has any ideas of things that I can do differently that make it easier, or encourage people more to feel free to talk in the chat, please let me know, because I'm always, the point of all of this, of heuristics, of neurodiversity, of executive functioning, all of everything is limited. Nothing is perfect, nothing is completable. So once your brain deems that something is done, completed, then you just don't pay attention to it anymore. And I know that I am limited, and that I do things that are useful and also not perfect. So I always want to learn more. Sometimes you forget what you were talking about, but you always get it back very soon. How do you do that? Think back on your tracks. I want that too. So I think I know what you're referring to, and there's two different things that you could be referring to. So let me put that out there first, just to make sure that I think what you're talking about is when I say, oh, I can't remember why I brought this up, and I'll pause for a second, and then I'll remember why I brought it up. The other thing that it could be is that in the course of a conversation, something comes up, and then we move on to something else before that initial thing was resolved, and I remember to get back to the initial thing to try and close it. And they're related, but I assume you mean the first, that when I forget something and I kind of draw it back. And it's not a secret. Both. Okay. Well, we'll do one at a time. It's just practice, just like anything. The way you get better at anything is doing it a lot. I spend a lot of time, and have for my entire life, being like, wait, how did I arrive at this? It's kind of like intermittent observation, right? That I'll notice that I'm singing a song, and I'll be like, why am I singing this song? Where did this come from? I don't think I would have just randomly brought it up. So then I think back. So it really starts with just backtracking as much as you can. Every time you forget something, you try and backtrack. When you get lost, you can sub in what would make sense. So I don't remember what I thought that got me. I remember A and B and C, but C doesn't lead to where I'm at now. And I can't remember what's in that gap. So now I'm recreating it. Well, what might C have led to that could then lead to this other thing, that can lead to this other thing that could get to where I am? So partly it's remembering, and partly it's going back to as much as you can remember, and then just starting there again and trying to get. And again, I run those cycles quickly. The other thing is, I'm trying to figure out a more broad way to answer this question that's like more helpful. Not in reverse. I do it in reverse sometimes, but what you're doing it in reverse is the practice, right? I know where I'm at. How did I get here? So I'm practicing going backwards. If it's, I forgot where I was at, what was I trying to think of? I forgot. Then I need to go back to where I can remember and work forward to it again. Once you become aware of something, once something enters working memory, it only leaves in one of two ways. Either you forget about it, or you process it into long-term memory. And the vast majority of things just get forgotten, mostly because they're no longer relevant, and other new data comes in that the brain is deeming more relevant, more worth spending our resources on. And so it just gets pushed out. That's kind of what we mean when we say forgot, is we're holding it in working memory, which is short-term storage, until other things are coming into working memory such that we need to free up space, and it gets pushed out. We're no longer aware of it. So in fact, I'm doing it right now, right? I lost my train of thought, but I know what I'm talking about, and I can go back. Yeah, resources are finite. So, and then I can work back to the same thing. And by the way, I'm much better at it in this context, because the things that I'm talking about here are things that I talk about more frequently. So it's easier for me to say, okay, I'm at this point. How might I have gotten here? I've gotten to this point a bunch of times, so I have some experience to play with there. Anyway, so once you're aware of it, it only goes, you forget it, or it goes into long-term memory, which colloquially we talk often about knowing things that I know are in long-term memory. Things that I'm aware of are in working memory. I'm actually presently, consciously thinking of it. And of course, we know way more than we're aware of in any given moment, which is an important distinction. So if I forgot something, it's because it got pushed out, always. The only question is whether whatever it was that I was thinking of is something that my brain will notice and deem relevant again and bring back in. And that can happen in a couple different ways. So just to be clear, one thing is I notice a thing, either I deem that it's, it's irrelevant. The fact that I heard a car horn honk 5 seconds ago I'm not making any connection with that to anything else, except that, of course, I've used it now. So I will remember it, but otherwise I would have forgotten it very quickly. Sometimes there's a problem and I notice things. This is universal stuff, not Brandon, but any of us. Sometimes there's a problem and we notice things in relationship to that problem. We utilize it to solve the problem in one way or another. And so then we forget about it and it doesn't come back. But sometimes there are problems that we forget things about, but the problem persists. It's still a problem for us. So at some point in the future, we notice it again, and then maybe notice the same things about it, maybe notice different things, but it comes back in because it's there. And one particular thing that I call juggling is when for whatever reason, so I have more stuff that I'm trying to be aware of than I can fit into my awareness, right? So something's going to get pushed out. But for whatever reason, I deem all of it important. And so when something gets pushed out, instead of freeing up that space completely, the awareness I have of a thing gets bumped down to just a little marker of, don't forget there was something there. And so this is just my weird language that I use to describe things, but we all have that sense of like that nagging thought in the back of your head about there's something I was supposed to be doing or whatever. So I call it juggling because I think of it as I'm trying to fit more in there than can fit, but all of it I think is important, so I don't want to lose anything. So I throw something out and leave a marker of don't forget something's there. But then I know that marker, and so I follow that thread until I find the thing again and pull it back in, and then something else gets thrown out and has a marker left of don't forget something's there. So it's kind of like throwing things and leaving a marker and then pulling this back in, and that bumps out. And it is not a good feeling. We've all been there. It's overwhelming. It's terrible. So that's kind of like forgetting in a sense. I'm remembering that there's something I forgot, basically, instead of just completely forgetting it completely. So honestly, it's just a lot of practice, and part of what makes me so weird, and I am very weird. I'm very specialized, which makes me really, really well suited for some things and really, really terribly suited for other things. I'm not an easy person to communicate with. I'm a compelling person often, at least that's the feedback that I seem to get. An interesting person, but not always an easy person to communicate with. I spend my whole day talking. I'm in sessions and I'm in meetings, and I literally will all day long, 8 hours, 9 hours, 10 hours, whatever, just be talking. And then when I go home, I want to talk more because that's how my brain works. So it's just a lot of practice of what did I, and so I'm retracing things in that way. There are things that you can do to improve on that. And basically it's all about connections and narratives. You can look into, there are memory competitions where people, as like a contest, they have to they get a deck of cards and they have 5 minutes to memorize the cards in order starting from the top down, and whoever gets the furthest into that wins that event, and so on. And you can look at interviews of people that do that, and they'll talk about what they do, and it's really just narrative, but a lot of it is what we've talked about. It's semiotics. You create signs and symbols for things. So this is why like words are so important to me, because we can take very big and complex things and boil it down into a very simple word. But as long as we know that word, we can always re-expand it into the same thing. So as a random example, birthday, that the concept of what a birthday is, if anybody said, what do you mean birthday? Well, that's the day every year that's the same date as you were born on, right? Like So a baby is born, and a year later, exactly 365 days later, except 366 days later, once every 4 years because of a leap year, we say that's the anniversary. It's been 1 year. You know what I mean? Like, describing it in full detail without using the word is very complicated, but we encode all that into the word birthday. So now we just say birthday and look at how much easier it is to remember that. So same kind of deal. You want to be better at remembering something, develop language around that thing. This is why I use scaling so much, because scaling meaning applying a scale to something, 1 to 100 or whatever. Scaling is just a way to make up new language for a thing. If the language I have is I'm irritable, I'm angry, I'm happy, I'm sad, I'm excited, those emotion words, great. I can notice and remember that. But if I remember one time I was excited and another time I was excited, it's very hard for me to remember the difference between those two things, because I've compressed the experience down into the word excited, and to re-expand it in detail of exactly which one were you more excited. I could do it, but it's not as efficient. Whereas if I say, okay, I'm 73 excited today, then I'll remember that, right? So we make up language, and yeah, I've made up a lot of language around this. Makeup, by the way, doesn't mean I invented the word. Makeup means I have connected in my head a word and a certain meaning, even if it's one that's taught to me, which obviously the vast, vast majority of what we do through language is taught to us. Is actually also very complicated. Everything's complicated if you get deep enough into it. And there's debate. There's something called linguistic determinism, which is the idea that what we're capable of doing cognitively is gated by the language that we use, which is personal to us. There's overlap, but a word means a different thing to me. And it's not just words. It's, that picture over there has a specific, it's connected to things. So when we're talking about signs or semiotics, 95, okay with that, I like that. When I say signs or semiotics, all we mean is I've taken a thing and I've connected it to something else that it is not inherently connected to. The word birthday, the sounds I'm making when I say birthday, has no inherent connection to the concept of birthday. We just made a connection there and kind of linked it up. That's what making a sign is, connecting two things that would otherwise be unconnected, but using one of those things as a small marker to contain the bigger data. A lot of this has to do with schema too. But anyway, there are people who are on the kind of opposite side of things from that linguistic determinism viewpoint, where they're saying, no, we all internally have our own, not our own, we all have the same basic cognitive language framework, whatever. We express it differently, we behave differently based on, external language that we learn, but inside it's the same. Again, they're both constructs. And so the question is, which one do you find most useful? Because we can't prove either one. I tend to rely more on linguistic determinism because I see it be useful a lot, that when you teach someone a new word, there's a specific phenomenon. I want to say it's called the Baader-Meinhof phenomenon, but I could be mixing something up there, which is once you learn a word or a concept, the illusion that thing all of a sudden appears in your life disproportionately frequently afterwards. Meaning, I never knew what Flübelige was before, but then I learned Flübelige, and now in the next week, I've seen Flübelige 17 times. I've never seen it in my life, and now it's happened 17 times. I think it's most useful to just attribute that to, once you learn the language, once you have a perceptual set and a way to kind of compress that, the brain is going to notice it more and remember it more. So, long way of saying, it's easier to remember things when you have good language around it. And again, that's domain specific, meaning it's about the specific thing you're doing. So wherever you tend to notice, I forget things in this place a lot, in this area, category, topic a lot, let me start coming up with language for it. Including things that are simple. Here's a practical. Including things that seem like that shouldn't work, will often work. So if you forget your keys, lose your glasses a lot, you'll get the advice commonly of have a designated spot for it. And that will work oftentimes, not always. because you're building that as a new piece of your own internal language. Where are my glasses? They're in the spot where I put my glasses, right? But if you are someone who has a hard time consistently putting things in the same spot, what you can do is create, I'm making this up right now, but it theoretically would work. That's how this work happens, by the way. We have frameworks and understandings, and then we use that to come up with specific ideas that should theoretically work, but then we have to test it. So here's the thing. Come up with different areas to put things around your house that maybe are not connected to specific things. They might have a home, right? Their default place of being. But instead, it's here's the command center, and there's the tray, and there's the junk drawer, and whatever, you name each of those places. And then when you're looking for something, it's more likely that you'll remember, oh, I left that in the tray, instead of, oh, I left that in this spot that I have no word for, right? Okay, so probably not the Baader-Meinhof thing. Now I really want to know what it is. The Baader-Meinhof gang was a West German far-left militant organization founded in 1970. So no, I made some connection in my head between the concept of the language that was not accurate, which again happens all the time. And in that case, obviously, part of that connection included the uncertainty about the connection. That's why I remembered and said, I could be wrong. This doesn't seem right. That in that encoding somewhere was also a little piece of, you're not sure about this. Which, by the way, yeah, probably not. Which, by the way, the more you do a thing, the more information you get. There's only two ways to get new information, either by observation of the environment or from somebody else telling you about it using language and signs and all this stuff we're discussing, right? Because that pulls things up in your cognition. I'm so distracted and curious about why my brain thought Baader-Meinhof now. But anyway, I'll have to look it up later. Yeah, the only way to learn new information is to observe it directly from the environment. You can do a lot in your head, a lot. You cannot create new information. You can combine and recombine and organize and categorize. You can take the information you have and create new things with it. It's kind of like any writer will tell you, there's nothing new under the sun, right? Like, it's old wine in new bottles. It's not about new things. It's about combining old things in new ways. Nobody's, if nothing else, somebody who's writing something in English, every word they write, with maybe a few exceptions, are words that other people use, right? But we combine them in different ways. So every attempt you make on a thing gives you more data and information about the thing. Every time you talk about or read about the thing with somebody else gives you more information about the thing. And one thing that helps with that is feeling safe. And privilege plays into this a lot, right? That even though I know that I'm not sure that Baader-Meinhof is the right word, I'm just going to throw it out there anyway, with the caveat that I don't know that it's the right one. But I feel safe enough to do that, and that it's not going to cause me problems, that people aren't going to be like, oh man, what a terrible person you are because you made an incorrect guess at what that thing was called, right? Which, again, really distracting me. My brain really wants to resolve what that is. I'm going to do it as soon as I sign off. There's many reasons I feel safe to do that, and a lot of that has to do with privilege. But because I feel safe, I make an attempt. And because I make an attempt, I now know more about the thing. And therefore, next time, I'm more likely to feel safe again because I have more experience, and try it again and try it again and try it again. I think that's a more helpful way to look at the 10,000 hours thing that, Malcolm Gladwell talks about, as opposed to that anybody who spends 10,000 hours will be a genius at a thing, that there are variables that matter other than just you and what you have done in the past in anything. Just, be aware of that. And so what I do at this point, including how I can do this stream and sit here and just talk for an hour, and it's really not taxing. I enjoy doing it. part of the reason I can do that is because I feel safe to put out what I have. If somebody were to ask me, it's happened many times a day, you say, oh, is this how evolution works? And I can say, well, I don't know, but here are the pieces of it I do know, or at least, here are the pieces of it that I think are helpful for me to say, even if I'm not sure about them, or maybe there are other pieces I do feel confident that I know, but don't seem relevant. If somebody says, I'm struggling with blank, I'm not really ever going to come back in this context and say, there's nothing I can tell you there. I'm almost always going to say, well, that's mostly out of my field, but here is a thing that maybe might be helpful or relevant to you, but I don't know. I'm going to try something, and I'm going to be careful about what I try and try to be aware and cognizant of what impact that might have. But yeah, that's how you get better at something. As far as the second, and we got to wrap up here, the second part of, the second way of defining how do you remember things that you forgot about before, that tracking what threads have come up, what folders have been opened that we need to kind of go back. Again, that's practice. And for me, it's the specific practice of two things. One is a skill that's broadly applicable, and one is a context. The skill is listening. Needed to sit there. And maybe I'll do a whole thing on listening. Maybe that would have been a good thing to do on today. Listening. Listening is just a vastly, vastly more complicated thing than people think that it is. Nobody actually hears everything. We hear enough that our brain deems, okay, that's enough. I got it. Now I can figure out and fill in the gaps, and we can move forward. Brain's a cognitive miser. And a lot of it, the time, we do see this in testing even, where there's an inverse correlation between intelligence, the ability to make predictions on a thing, or the predisposition at least to make predictions on a thing, and auditory processing, which is usually measured in terms of how much does someone remember the specific things that they heard. Well, the better your brain is at saying, of the 10 words you said, I could identify the 2 important ones and drop the other 8, and then use those 2 important ones to kind of fill in the gap and get where we need to go. So that's just an aspect of listening. But I've practiced the skill of listening a lot, and I started by default as not being great at hearing everything because my brain was like, yeah, I've heard enough, and have I've been trained by my mentors and teachers, and continue to work on it myself. And I train my staff and practice myself. We literally, I'll do something in supervision where I say, somebody hear that person, and what you're supposed to do is verbatim, word for word, as best you can, say back everything that they just said. And nobody can do it 100%. Not anybody, but the more you practice it, the better you get at it. And then you have more things to put together. So that's the broad skill. The second is the specific context of a therapy session or a coaching session, which lasts about an hour. And I have a structure and a framework and language for how to go through that, and how to kind of categorize, this thing that came up, and let me put a pin in that because that's not what we're doing right now, but I don't want to lose track of it, so that I can remember to come back to it. And sometimes that involves notes, like external notes, and sometimes it doesn't. But yeah, both of them are just practice. And it's all about connection and language. That if I can say, it's a lot easier for me to say, okay, we brought up, again, I don't know, what's a concept? They brought up the deficit model there. They're thinking of themselves in terms of deficit. Is a lot easier for me to track and remember because it's just a small little thing that I can re-expand when I need to, as opposed to, okay, they seem to be upset because they're talking about the fact that they're different from other people in a way that causes them problems. And it seems like other people just seem to know some secret that they don't know, and that their struggles are their own fault and whatever. Like, I can contain all that data in a smaller thing. So create language and practice. That's pretty much it. All the research shows us that we don't actually remember an event, no matter how accurate the memory is. We remember the last time we remembered it, the previous time we remembered it. So every time we pull something from long-term memory into working memory, what we're doing, actually, this would have been a fascinating topic today too. What we're doing is re-expanding and using Gestalt perceptual principles, not principles, it's just how the brain works, to fill in the gaps. Pick any memory. I'll do this exercise and then we'll go. And I won't do the whole thing. Maybe we'll do more next time. Birthday. We're talking about birthday day. Pick a memory of a birthday, any birthday, yours, somebody else's, real, fictional, just a birthday you remember. Any memory of a birthday. Now, on that birthday, that day you woke up and you went to sleep, right? Any point in between those 2 points, after you woke up and before you went to sleep, pick a specific moment from that day and freeze it. And do your best to get a visual image of that moment, a freeze frame of that moment. And then we can make all kinds of predictions. But without going into all the details, just look at this. Try and zoom in on any part of that picture. You might know who was there. Well, where exactly were they standing? Who was next to you and who was next to them and who was next to them, or how far away were they? You can have kind of a vague concept of an image, but not the actual full detailed image. The brain just kind of fills in the gaps. But if you try to look closely, all of a sudden it's like, oh, there's nothing there, or it's blurry or whatever. Anyway, we're over time. This was fun. Thank you for being here. I'll say Kitch Squatch, thank you, Kitch Squatch. I don't even know if it's just you and me today, but thank you, Kitch Squatch, for being in the chat and talking with me, and everybody else who's here and listening or watching or in the future. Thank you for this time. And I will be back maybe by myself and maybe with somebody next week. Thank you all. Have a good week.